All right. So this is Miserere by Gregorio Allegri. It was written in 1630, and it's an amazing piece of music, but it actually has a really amazing story behind it too. Because for over 150 years, this piece of music was never heard outside the Sistine Chapel in Rome. The choir was sworn to secrecy, the manuscripts were kept under lock and key, and it was the ultimate piece of closed source for the 15th century. Until 1770, when a young, prodigious boy went to hear a performance of this piece of music in the evening mass. And he loved it so much that he committed it to memory. And that evening when he left the church, or left the Sistine Chapel, he went back to his rooms and he wrote from memory the entire manuscript out for this incredible piece of music. So of course that prodigy was Mozart. And he took the manuscript that he'd written from memory of this secret piece of music and he took it to London and he published it. We might say he open sourced it. And it became phenomenally popular. People loved it. And for hundreds of years since, billions of people have been touched by the beauty of this piece of music. So I like to think of Mozart as the original open source hacker. He took something that was closed, he opened it up, and he made the world a much better place for it. And this story reminds me that for hundreds of years, open has always trumped closed. Being connected has always trumped isolation, and sharing has always trumped secrecy. We could just sit here for 40 minutes listening to it if you'd like. It's lovely. So in a humble way, this story has informed us about our open source program at Facebook. We take open source very seriously. We have 200 active projects on GitHub comprising 10 million lines of code. We have many hundreds of our engineers working on these open source projects, and we have active and engaged communities. We have 100,000 followers. We have 20,000 forks across all of our GitHub projects alone. And we contribute to a wide range of other projects as well, from the Linux kernel through to Mercurial, grep, D, etc. We've even open sourced the designs to our data centers and the hardware designs that we use for our servers through the Open Compute project. And in this talk, I really want to kind of talk about some of the experiences that we've gained through all of these programs and hopefully share a collection of tips that we've learned along the way. So firstly, why is open source so important to Facebook? And the reason is that open source is dorm room friendly. Our open source roots stretch right back to 2004 when a young undergraduate in his dorm room decided to build a new website and picked the open source software that was available. Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, classic LAMP stack. Since then, of course, we've grown, but our appetite for being able to use open source has not diminished. What has increased, of course, is our ability to contribute back and our capacity to get involved with communities and help make them a better place. Of course, the pattern goes something like this. We find some open source software that we think will help solve a problem that we have. We normally scale that because we are obviously operating at a relatively large scale. And what often happens is that we find the limitations of that piece of software. Sometimes we just go beyond the scaling parameters of many of the projects that we start to use. So what do? Okay, we try to improve them. We try to make them work better in scaled environments. Sometimes we have to replace them and create alternatives. But most importantly, we make sure that we release all of that work back again. And we see this pattern happening over and over again at Facebook. A great example would be Mark's decision to use PHP. As we scaled Facebook, we began to learn that PHP had some limitations. And so we built the hip-hop compiler, we built the hip-hop HHVM project, both of which we open sourced, and we've even more recently evolved the PHP language itself to create Hack, which we launched back in March. And there are countless other examples of this cycle happening at Facebook all the time, whether it's our data infrastructure, our web infrastructure, our mobile tools, or our JavaScript tooling. But it's not just that open source is an important part of our technology stack, it's also closely aligned with our hacker culture. It's an important part of how our engineering organization is perceived. So we did a recent survey for some of the new engineers that had joined the company. And we asked them, had you been aware of the open source program at Facebook before you joined? And 2/3 of them said they had, which is great. But half of those people, in other words, 1/3 of our new engineers, said that our open source program had positively contributed to their decision to join the company. So it's really helping to get good quality engineers in to help work on the problems that we have. What's also really interesting is that a large number of those people said they were able to directly use their experience of having worked with our project in the open when they came to the company, which meant that they were able to get more efficient and they were able to get ramped up quicker on their jobs once they joined the company. So that's a huge win for us as a company. And it's really easy for me to be able to point to these kind of anecdotes and really emphasize why open source is valuable for us as a company. I think this is probably an important point for anyone that's working on open source inside a larger company. You need to be able to articulate the value of it. So I'm going to give a number of tips as we go through here. This is tip 0, zero-based array, of course. And I would say this: always make sure you can articulate the value of open source and what it brings to your company. There are always costs to open sourcing, so make sure you understand the benefits. There are always investments that you need to make, so figure out how you're going to get the returns. So yeah, it helps a lot when your CEO and president wrote the first line of code in PHP, but naive ideology will only get you so far. You need to be able to point to data in a large company in particular to be able to make the point that you need to continue on this work. So we're confident that investing in open source helps our own engineering stack, and we're confident that it improves our perception amongst the engineering community. But actually, it just means we do a better job. Open source helps us to keep our technology fresh. It helps us to justify the architectural decisions that we're making. It helps keep our interfaces clean. It helps get more eyes on our code. And as one of my colleagues recently said, open source is like the breeze from an open window. It gives our technology a chance to breathe, it improves its quality, and it stops it from going stale. But if you were to wind the clock back about a year, and if you were to look at our GitHub repos, you would have seen this. 320, an iOS library that we launched back in 2000. Support of 320 has been discontinued. You would have seen our PHP SDK deprecated. And you might have seen our fork of Memcached, which has been very popular, but which has the description test, and whose 3 last commits were 5, 6, and 7 years ago, respectively. You might think I am joking. I am not joking. So we just weren't doing a good job. And it's a common peril of companies that are launching open source projects, and it's the throw it over the wall syndrome, right? Get it out there, we're done. And we were guilty of this, I'm afraid to say. But when you do throw something over the wall like that and forget about it, it's almost worse than not having done it at all. A fundamental tenet of the open source philosophy, I think, is that you need to continue to care about what it is you release. And if you don't take care of it, then how can you possibly expect the community to care about it? And so, of course, on this virtual circle here, there's a piece missing, which is this. It's absolutely essential that you continue to use the projects that you open source. Use the same version. Don't create internal forks unless you have an absolutely essential reason to. And make sure that you have that imperative to keep that code fresh and to keep working on it, because your community will notice if you do not. And so this is tip number 1, which is the second tip. Use your own open source. Dog food. Now, sometimes you're going to have to integrate an open source project with other internal, proprietary, or closed source solutions. I know that. But actually, figuring out how to do that well makes the project better. It means you architect your APIs better. It means perhaps you implement a plugin architecture or some adapter architecture that actually just makes the project better. And we did this with Presto. Presto is our own big data query engine. And sure, it connects to lots of different sorts of open source databases and data warehouses and so on, but internally we need to connect it to all sorts of other closed systems. But right from the start, we were able to develop Presto on GitHub in the open from the first commit. And the reason we were able to do that is that we had a very strong plugin architecture. So there were plugins for all of the open source data sources, and then there were connectors that we used internally for all of our own private stuff, which we just choose not to open source. Nevertheless, as I said, a year ago, we just weren't doing a good job at this. So we didn't even have an open source team. And we thought it would probably be a time to kind of start refreshing things and getting our house back in order. Coincidentally, at exactly the same time, our web team, our front-end UI team, open-sourced a project they called React. They launched it in May at JSConf. And the team behind React is absolutely brilliant, right? It is one of the most exciting things that's happened in the JavaScript world for several years. And it's been really, really successful, and they've had a huge number of contributors and a really active community engagement. But at the time, the fact that they launched this was a breath of fresh air. It reminded Facebook, it reminded us as a company that we knew how to do open source well. We knew how to get great new projects out there. But what was really interesting is that the initiative for that came from the engineering team itself. There wasn't some centralized developer relations team or some centralized developer advocacy team that drove this project. It came from the engineers themselves. And we've seen that happen over and over again, whether it's HHVM, whether it's React, whether it's Hack or Buck. You know, these are all projects that come out of our engineering teams. And this is a template that works really well for us. And so this is another tip, I think. Make sure you decentralize project ownership. Do not try to gather together all the open source into one place organizationally. Make sure that the engineering teams that work on it are the sole custodians. And this means that external engineers are interacting with internal engineers directly. There's a much faster feedback loop. It disabuses those communities of any notion that they're dealing with some anonymous monolith. It means that we have engineers talking to engineers. And it's worked really well for us. It's really improved the quality of our project. So anyway, as we looked at this reboot, we figured out, you know, these new launches like React were going really well, but we needed to figure out, like, what did we already have? What did the portfolio look like? And how were we going to get it under control? So in the spirit of you can't improve what you can't measure, we figured out that there were three key questions we needed to answer. So we have tens and hundreds of projects that have been released over the years, but we needed to know, you know, which projects did we own? Who was contributing to them? How healthy were they? And implicitly, if these weren't good answers, what we were going to do about it. So the good news was that pretty much all of our projects were on GitHub. And GitHub's fantastic, of course. Not every one of our projects on GitHub, but most of them are. So at least we knew where they all were. And even better news, of course, is that GitHub has a great API. So it made it really easy for us to automate a script, write a script, I wrote it in Hack actually, that went and accessed this API, enumerated all of our projects, figured out, you know, all of the metadata about that project. We looked at every repo. We looked at all the metadata for every repo. We looked at every commit. We looked at every pull request. We looked at every issue. So we really started to immediately build up a good sense of what these projects were doing. Now, it turns out that we have a little bit of database capacity at Facebook. So we stored all this data and literally put it into MySQL. So every one of our projects is now in MySQL. We have the follower figure, we have the forks figure, we have the number of commits, we have the number of issues, and the number of pull requests. Now, I love GitHub, but I actually find it easier to use SQL to find out what's going on in our portfolio than the GitHub UI. It just makes it easier to sort and filter and look at what's going on. And pretty quickly, we saw that there were some things we needed to address. I don't know if you can see about 2/3 of the way down, there's a project called Animation. I have no idea what this project is supposed to be. It had been in there for years, but it had 0 followers, 0 forks, 0 commits, and 0 pull requests. It had one issue raised against it. I'm going to guess that issue was something like, where is it? And this is obviously a project that somebody had vainly launched and not really thought about what they were doing. So we killed that one, and many others that were in a similar kind of state. We also quickly realized that we could do this import process again and again and again and get a quick way of seeing how these trends evolved over time. As you can imagine, I'm now one of the world's foremost experts in the GitHub API throttling mechanism. At the scale that we're operating, we are hitting their thresholds quite easily. But we've actually industrialized this sync process quite well now, so that it runs very, very efficiently. And we're able to set up triggers when anything changes, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this has meant two important things. The first thing is that by synchronizing this data, we're able to invest in instrumentation. We're able to start building up these time series of data about what is happening in our open source portfolio. What do you do when you have a time series data set? Well, you create metrics. And this is a screenshot of one of our internal metrics tools called Argus. And what you can see here is the total number of GitHub watchers on our repository from February to April. And you can see it's rising over time from about 80,000 to 105,000. You can't actually get this directly from GitHub. They don't provide a historical view of the number of followers or stars or whatever on a project. But by polling every minute or so, we've been able to build this series up over time. What's interesting, of course, is when there are inflection points. What was going on? What have we done well to make this grow? The beginning of March, we launched an iOS library called Shimmer, which was very popular. And at the end of March, we launched another one called Tweaks, which was also very popular. So those two surges are our renewed investment in the iOS developer community. So it might sound very enterprise-like, but actually being able to start monitoring these metrics and being able to start publishing the data about how we're making progress is a really powerful way to articulate within the company like how the program's going. And at a meta level, it shows that we're being disciplined. It shows that we know we need to get things sorted out. And we get respected for being able to point to these empirical data sets. So a year on, we now have about 35 metrics that we measure across our entire portfolio. I'm not going to run through each one of these, but they're all related to the sort of activity that we see in those projects, sliced and diced by various metrics. So Winston Churchill once said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And I'm going to say that these are the worst 35 metrics you can use to measure open source success, but better than all the others. It's very, very difficult to empirically articulate how well an open source project is going numerically, but we try our best. And in fact, there are 5 that we find particularly valuable. Average followers per repo, average forks per repo. We use average rather than total amount because that encourages us to keep the quality over the quantity. We also look at the average pull request and issue age, not the total number of pull requests and issues. So having lots of pull requests and lots of issues is actually a good signal, right? Because it means people are really working on the project. But having lots of really old and stale ones lying around is not. So we total up how many days these things have been open and hold teams to that metric. And then finally, we look at the number of external commits that we're getting from people who are not Facebook employees. The second thing that this has allowed us to do is invest in tools. Some of these tools are tools that I build for myself, so I can monitor the quality of the portfolio as a whole. But most of the tools are ones that we build for the teams so that they can run their projects as successfully as possible. They're all hosted on our intranet. This is a rare sighting of what the Facebook intranet looks like. This is the open source page. And what you can see are 4 high-level metrics that we value greatly, with links to other data about our projects and links to the projects themselves. And this is visible to everybody in the company, from Mark down. I don't know whether Mark looks at it, but if he wanted to, he could. So we know exactly what's going on, and everybody is totally aware of the kind of metrics that we're following. We have a big view of all the project, and you can sort it, and you can filter it, and you can see when everything was launched, and you can see which ones are doing well and which ones are doing badly. What is interesting, though, is that you can drill into this and see we have an owner column. So we have, for every single project that we launched, a very clearly defined project owner who's an employee, and that's someone that I can automatically assign internal tasks to if there are incoming pull requests or issues. That's somebody that I can go and hassle if the project is not going well, and also if that person ever leaves the company, as in fact happened with Tornado, I get a little red flashing light that tells me I need to go and find their manager or figure out who is going to continue to steward this project from then on. And in fact, in the case of Tornado, we used the departure of that employee as an opportunity to donate the Tornado project back out to the community that had been running it. And in fact, we have now transferred its ownership. So behind the scenes, one of the things we do is make sure that all of our engineers, or as many of our engineers as possible, have their internal Facebook profile associated with their GitHub identity. So we have a small OAuth flow, and every new engineer who joins the company is encouraged to go through this flow so that we have that linkage between their GitHub identity and their employee identity. And this then means that we can track how many commits have come from people who were employed by the company and how many commits were created on GitHub by people who were not employed by the company, which, as I said, is one of our valuable metrics. So this small little OAuth flow here has unlocked all sorts of valuable data about what's going on. So that's tip number 5. Always establish ownership. Make sure these projects never just flap in the wind. They're never orphaned. And especially since we federate this program so much, all these teams are running all of these projects, there's no way for one single individual to know what's going on. So make sure each and every project is owned by somebody. All right, so back to the tools quickly. Here's what happens when you click through on one of those rows and you see a more detailed view of a particular project. This is HHVM, and you can see the data and you can see the commits that are coming in on the internal tools. We also show metrics and the same kind of dashboard that you saw before, but just scoped to that one project. Okay, so individual teams can track their own progress, and many individual teams, HHVM is a good example, many individual teams actually set quarterly or semesterly goals for themselves based on some of these metrics, which is really exciting for me. Okay. And they also know that we share many of these stats with the engineering directors around the company, so they know that these numbers are being paid attention to. And that kind of social pressure means that they do a good job of all the things they need to do to keep their projects going well. And in fact, what's happened is we've ended up gamifying this much more than I expected. We now have individual teams competing with each other to get better metrics each half or each quarter. So for example, I can tell you at the moment that the React team and the iOS POP library have almost exactly the same number of followers on GitHub as each other. And I can also tell you that both teams know that too. We're in a kind of a little space race going on with the iOS team and the JavaScript team trying to see who can get the most followers. So in the absence of me being able to manage these teams directly, basically gamification and these tools has been a really exciting way to encourage them to perform well. Okay, so what does it take to launch a project at Facebook? Firstly, we strive to make this as easy as possible. Like, engineer time is valuable. We do not want to spend engineers spinning their wheels with lawyers unnecessarily. And we want to minimize the bureaucracy and the effort that it takes to get a project out of the door. Nevertheless, we want to make sure that they're doing it with the best intentions and that they're doing it with discipline. So we actually have a short checklist that we ask teams to go through, and there are about 8 questions on it. It looks scary, but in fact it isn't. Most of these questions have simple one-word answers. And we ask each team to fill this out before we agree to open source something. But I don't know if any of you know the story of, I think it was Van Halen, who used to have a clause in their contract about brown M&Ms backstage at their gigs, and if they ever found a brown M&M, they knew that the production team hadn't read the rest of the rider. So I bury the most important question in here at number 6, and in the hope that they'll notice. And it is this: who will maintain the project, accept contributions, and liaise with the community? Very benign-looking question, but the answer is absolutely vital, because I absolutely need to know that a team is committed to doing this once the project has launched. And sometimes it's an individual. It's the original founder of the project, the engineer that started it. Or sometimes as a team grows or as a project grows, the team will kind of share that community work amongst them. I will point out that the teams that have one individual focused on community interactions tend to do it better than those teams that split the community interaction across multiple people. And I think it's because 100% of an engineer's time is more effective than 20% of an engineer's time. I think it's a context switching thing. If you're working on internal work and then you have to switch across to interacting with people on GitHub, there's kind of like that impedance mismatch there. But what some teams have done is establish an on-call rotation where basically one individual will be the open source liaison for a whole week, and then they'll switch it on to the next person for the next week and so on. And that works well. In terms of licensing, I am just not interested in open source licensing drama. So we have a very, very strong template that we basically expect all of our projects to adhere to. We stick to BSD for every project. We do occasionally use Apache. We do occasionally use Boost. And really the only reason that we would look at using other projects, other licenses rather, is when the target community has a very strong culture of using that license. So we don't want to impose different licenses on communities that aren't familiar with them. But I will say we have an excellent legal team. Our open source lawyers are fantastic, really, really responsive. So there's a mini tip in there, I think. First, choose your lawyers. It makes it really, really easy. So when we launch a project, what happens? So we have a tool that allows teams to upload their repos to a GitHub repo and for it to remain private. We make sure that they get everything in shape. We make sure that all the headers are in the right place, all the licenses are good. We have a small linter that we run across these projects to make sure we haven't accidentally open sourced something we shouldn't have done. And then we pick a day and we pick a time. It's normally a Tuesday or a Wednesday or a Thursday, and we normally try to get it out at about 10 a.m. in the morning to actually launch the project. We flick it live. We tweet about it on our FB open source Twitter account. We post it to our /engineering page on Facebook. And for major releases, we'll also do an engineering blog on code.facebook.com. And then the social media magic kicks in, right? And the teams hang out on Hacker News and on Reddit to sort of take questions about the project that they've just launched. And fortunately, we have pretty good reach through these channels, so we tend to get pretty good announcements and pretty good momentum from the first day. We also have an internal Facebook group for anyone that's interested in open source, and we have 600 or 700 users in there, 600 or 700 employees in there. And we also announce every release in there, so there's like internal kudos for a launch. So one thing that's really cool about Facebook is that every Friday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mark gathers everybody together and takes questions and gives answers to them. And the Q&A session is kind of like a famous part of the Facebook culture. But at the start of that session every Friday, Mark will also talk about any products that we've released, any new apps that we've released, or any important new features or whatever. And what's really cool is that just in the last few months, he's taken to announcing some of the open source projects that we put out there, especially the larger ones. And you can just imagine how motivating that is for a team at Facebook. It's a large company now, and knowing that the CEO is aware of a project that you've worked on and announces it in front of the company is a huge, huge motivator. A lot of our open source comes from the infrastructure teams, and they are not necessarily used to launching things in the same way that some of our product teams are. So it's a huge, huge boost for them and a real motivator. And not surprisingly, I will often get a big surge in interest in the open source program after Mark has talked about a given release. But launching these things is step zero. It's actually remarkably easy to launch an open source project with respect to the effort you have to put in subsequently. And I drill this into the teams. I make sure that they realize this from the beginning. This is not a vanity thing. You just push it out and leave it. You have to know how to continue to keep it successful. So, I'm obsessed with data at this point. One of the things that I love to do is look at how the number of followers or forks or whatever of a repo varies as a function of time after its launch. So for the first 60 days of a project, we plot this. This is KVO controller, which is an iOS library we launched. And you can see that there's this kind of early bump of interest over the first week or so, which is the Hacker News and the Reddit effect. And then there's a gradual slope of increase. What often happens is that after a few months, people have got to the point where they've used the project and they're more familiar with it, and you'll see that curve rising again. But it's more the gradient of the second half of that graph that's of interest than how much you manage to make it pop on the first day. And here are two teams that managed to beat the curve, and this is fascinating. Like, how did they manage to beat that typical shape? And so in the case of Flow, they presented their project at a large JavaScript conference, and again, they almost tripled the number of people following their project. Origami did some press interviews with a tech publication, and again, boom, boom, 2 step changes, and again, they almost doubled the size of their communities. So, it's kind of obvious, but doing events, interacting with the community face-to-face, doing PR are all huge ways of growing your open source success. The other thing is that practice makes perfect. So the KVO controller team launched another 4 or 5 projects subsequently, and they did them at 2-week intervals. And each time, they got better at it. They were getting more and more followers on the first day. They were getting stronger and stronger growth in those projects after they launched, to the point at which they launched Shimmer, and there was a good pop at the beginning, but it then continued up with a good, solid climb. So practice makes perfect at getting these launches slick and getting that community interaction really going well. The climax of this was the final library that they launched back in April, which we call POP, and that just blew everything away. So this project got 4,000 followers on the first day, got 6,000 followers within the first week, and is now actually way north of 7,500 followers. So, those are quite big numbers. Obviously, we benefit from, our reputation, but I would like to say that the success of the POP project was built upon the success of all the previous iOS projects that we had done, and the people that were using that were then aware of POP when we came to launch it. And I think the other thing that's interesting to say about this is that the POP project had a closed beta for about 2 weeks before we launched, where people could have a look at it. It helped us to polish it, improve the quality of the code, but it also meant that out of the gate we had a really strong pickup. And those people that had been part of the closed beta were our best advocates. They went out and told the community about what they'd been working on for the last 2 weeks and really helped that early growth. And in fact, the reaction from the iOS community in particular has been strong. We got this wonderful quote from iOS Dev Weekly, which was that, "If Facebook keeps up this level of quality open source release much longer than this, I'll soon, he says, soon I'll need to forgive them for 320. So some sort of redemption is there for the taking if we can just get there. Okay. Obviously, we encourage all of our projects, or at least our major projects, to have websites of their own. We provide templates so that they can do it quickly and easily. Origami is a design tool. As you can see, our design team went off and built their own website, which looks much nicer than all the rest of them. But anyway, this, again, is a good statement of intent to the community. It shows that you really care about this stuff and that you've taken care over it. I mean, in terms of general community interaction, we have a pretty obvious playbook. We have IRC channels for them all. We have Facebook pages or groups, sometimes Google groups, mailing lists. We do regular blog posts. We have meetups. We run hackathons, all that usual stuff. It all works. It's all important. One particular technique that we found very valuable is something we call a community roundup. So the React team started doing this, and what they do is every week or so they will gather together all the places or all the mentions of React that they've seen in the community, all the cool projects that have built on the library, all the presentations about the library, all the tweets and so forth. And they put it all together in this roundup. And what's really powerful about that is it shows the rest of the community that it's not just Facebook working on this. It shows that there are people across the industry that are experimenting with it, and it kind of gives it that extra level of authenticity. We find that the first few weeks of external commits to a project are absolutely vital. We are obviously committed to triaging these things as quickly as possible. And I can guarantee that on the first day of an open source launch, you will get a whole host of pull requests. I can also guarantee that they will all be typos in your documentation that you've not fixed. And those are really easy things for people to fix. And actually, that's a feature, not a bug, right? Because it means that those people now feel comfortable about contributing. We try to be as friendly as possible, and they know that there are things they can work on straight away. So I would say this. Leave breadcrumbs, leave things for people to work on so that they can get on-ramped onto a project as early as possible. Maybe it's deliberate pieces of code that you haven't implemented. Maybe it's, like I say, documentation that they can work on. We've even joked that we might start deliberately putting typos into the documentation so that the community might have something to fix on the first day. We haven't actually come to that. As projects go on, they mature and they change and they have different destinies. And one thing that I think a lot about is, like, what is going to happen to this project in the long term? And there are lots of different things that can happen to an open source project. These are probably just some of them, in fact. One is that a project was just a snapshot by design. It was never meant to be something that was enhanced or incremented. It was just a snapshot of something that we had done. Sometimes we do this to accompany our academic publications because, true to the scientific method, we want people to be able to replicate our results. And generally, those are kind of read-only. They're rare, but we do that. Many of our projects we will open source with the explicit intent of getting it upstream. Two good examples of that are FB Thrift, which ironically is a fork of one of our own older projects, but which we're really working hard to get upstream to the original Apache Thrift. Another example would be WebScale SQL, where we've teamed up with Google and Twitter and LinkedIn to create a fork of, or a branch, I should say, of MySQL, and we're working really hard to get those changes upstream too. Flying the nest. I mean, if a project becomes really successful, at some point it shouldn't be a Facebook project anymore. It should go on to be its own thing. This is a destiny that we are looking at very strongly for a couple of our major projects. How can we make those go out into the world and be their own thing? And we'll just be a user like everybody else. Will we deliberately deprecate projects? They've just served their useful purpose. Or, will we just like reboot it and try to create a new project when it's, when the underlying technologies have changed or whatever? So definitely understand open source project lifecycles. People think a lot about launching, they think a lot about growth, but like, what is the end game? What does success mean for a given project? And it's important to think about getting the timing right on those things. You wouldn't send a toddler off to university, and you probably don't want your 40-year-old kids living at home. So make sure that your projects kind of graduate at the appropriate time to their size and community interaction. Okay, so where are we now? So the last 6 months was pretty exciting for us. We launched 65 new projects, which is 4 a month, or no, I don't know. Yeah, no, more than that. 2 a week, 2.5 a week. So the sheer volume of projects that we've launched is quite interesting. But I think it's more about quality than quantity. As I've stressed, every single one of these projects has a destiny, it has a team behind it, has a goal in mind. The other thing that's really exciting about this is the sheer variety of projects that we're releasing. We have databases, we have iOS libraries, we have Android libraries, we have JavaScript libraries, we have developer infrastructure, we have a programming language. We have everything in here. We're really looking at a broad portfolio at this point, which is very exciting. In terms of metrics, I mentioned these metrics earlier. Where were we a year ago? Well, that's where we were a year ago. We had 120 repos. And some of our pull requests and issues, our average age of those, in fact, was way over a year in the case of pull requests and almost a year in terms of issues. That's average age, which is pretty scary. So that was what we were starting from. And a year on, we've moved the needle, I think, significantly. We've launched a huge number of repos. We've doubled the number of followers. We've doubled our number of forks nearly. And we have increased the number of pull requests and issues, which, as I said, the absolute number doesn't worry me too much. But more importantly, we've been able to bring down that age, which is a sense of like how active we're being with the community. Now, I'm still not particularly proud of the fact that our average issue age is 6 months, okay? That is still pretty bad, but it is a lot better than it was before. We know we've got a long way to go. We know we're making progress, but we know there is still a lot to do. But that's absolutely fine, okay? As the Facebook motto goes, this journey is 1% finished. We know we have a lot to learn, and we'd love to, continue to talk about it at places like OSCON. This is tip number 10. Be open and connected. Our mission as a company is to help make the world open and connected. We, as engineers, want to be open and connected with you. And we want to share more about what we're doing. We want to help make the open source world a better place. And we want to be really good community citizens. And it's been a pleasure to share our journey with you today. Thank you very much. I have a couple of minutes for questions. Sure. I actually only have a forward button on this clicker. But anyway, tell me what it was that concerned you.
In the Facebook license, it was like the BSD style license, blah, blah, blah. For more information, see a file patents. Have you seen that?
Oh, sure. Okay. So what we do...
it sounds like it's BSD with GPL restrictions.
No, okay, so there's two separate things here. It's a straightforward BSD license. We do also provide a patent grant. And the purpose of the patent grant is simply to make sure that developers feel confident using our software. We're not going to chase after you for any IP violations. It's a patent grant. It's absolutely the same as what happens in Apache. I'm sorry? Confused as to? That's right. That's the same as Apache. Yeah. That's the same as Apache. Okay. I'm happy to talk more about it afterwards. Maybe one more question. Yep.
Yeah, I was curious about UCLA. How is it similar and different from other ones? And then you found that some people that would use that?
Okay, so the CLA, I'm happy to talk about the CLA actually. Didn't have a slide on it, but we have a CLA which again is basically the Apache CLA. The purpose of the CLA is not assignment. The purpose of the CLA is so that users of our project can feel confident that all the contributions that came from external contributors were theirs to give. And we try to make that flow as easy as possible. When you issue a pull request to GitHub, We have a little bot that comes by and says, doesn't look like you've signed the CLA, please sign it. There's a one-click flow through GitHub Auth to get you signed up, and then, yeah, you're free to contribute. So again, there's no assignation there. It's nothing scary. It's exactly the same as Google and the Apache CLA. I have 10 seconds here, so I'll take this quickly. So I knew someone was going to ask that. I actually thought that was going to be the first question. Have we open sourced the scripts that pull the data down from GitHub? And the answer is no, and I wish I had thought of that when we initially did it. Unfortunately, quite a lot of it is tied into the infrastructure, so I know I'm not dog-fooding my own philosophy. Nevertheless, we are committed to getting there, so we will be sharing as much of that as we can. Because, yeah, basically at this kind of scale, you have to use tools to keep track of this stuff. I think we're done for time, actually. So I'm going to be around for ages, so very happy to take questions. Thanks, guys.